All right, welcome to chapter 3. This one's going to be on ancient Greece. First off, if you haven't already, make sure you sign up for a presentation group. Thank you. It looks like 3 of the groups are already filled, and then 2 of them have people who have started to filter in. But yeah, if you haven't done that already, please do that right away, or I will assign you to one. You won't get to choose who you're with or what your topic is. To those groups that have been filled already, I'm going to reach out to you as soon as I assign all the groups, and that way we can start to cover what the project's going to look like and make sure you're set and know what you're working towards. But for now, we're going to talk about ancient Greece. So ancient Greece is, out of the ones we've talked about so far, the one that is most tied into modern day, because our Western philosophy, the philosophy of Europe and the United States, is largely influenced by the Greeks. Now, what the Greeks have thought, for example, with philosophers like Plato or Socrates, we have studied their thoughts and kind of built our philosophies based on them. I don't know, I looked over your course plans, but I don't know if you have a philosophy course here at Montreat. But if you have, I'm sure you talked a lot about Plato and a lot about Socrates. And that's because we derive a lot of what we think now from them. And that's the same with physical education and our thoughts regarding the body. This was a civilization that very much believed in having a sound, strong body, and that was core to their philosophy. And it was also important to them that they train their body, they educate their body as part of their overall education. So to be a good, well-rounded person, you were expected not only to have a strong mind, but you should also have a strong body. Now, the Greeks themselves were influenced by other civilizations. There's the Judaic civilization and the Phoenician civilization. Now, we're probably many people at Montreat are probably very familiar with the Judaic and the Jewish traditions, but the Jewish traditions very much believe in having a good, healthy body, and that's part of their religion, and part of their culture is being clean, being strong, being fit and representative of God. Now, the Phoenicians were seafaring people. They're kind of based out of modern day Lebanon, about over here, but they would sail through the Mediterranean Sea. They would trade, and as you can see, as they go to all these parts that you could consider part of their civilization, they would have to crisscross Greece. Now, the Phoenicians were big into games and sport, so it's thought that the Greeks probably picked up a lot of these concepts of sport and game from the Phoenicians and the Jewish civilization. Now, Greek metaphysics. We talked about metaphysics in our first chapter, so go ahead and take a second to remind yourself what that is. Can you tell me what it is? So yes, metaphysics is the study of the nature of reality. It's this connection between the mind and body, and the world around us, and what is real, what is reality. So with Greek metaphysics, we're looking at two kind of opposing philosophies. The first one is naturalistic. That's man's nature is both spiritual and corporal, which means like a physical. So they're both a person is not just their body and not just their spirit and their mind, but it's a combination of the two. It's kind of that dualism concept that we talked about in week 1. So the goal of this is to balance all these different aspects that are part of a person. That's their spirituality, their physical body, their intellectual mind. So by balancing spirit or soul, body, and mind, you can kind of create a well-rounded person, a well-educated person, and someone who is philosophically solid. Now, the opposite of this opposing concept, is anti-naturalistic. And that's that man's nature was created by the mind. That because the world around us is perceived by the mind, that the mind is chief to the reality of the world. The nature of reality comes from the mind, not the body and the spirit, but the mind. So, from a philosophy of physical education standpoint, what this means is that physical education is secondary to intellectual development. So, physical education is only important if it plays a role in the development of the mind and the intellect. Does that make sense? So, both of these views hold the mind in high esteem. Naturalistic does, anti-naturalistic does. But where they actually differed is that concept of the body. Naturalistic puts it at kind of an even weight, or at least a similar weight to the mind and the spirit, but the anti-naturalistic says mind is up here, the body just serves the mind because the mind is where reality comes from. Now, out of these two, the naturalistic view was far more popular in ancient Greece, even though you see evidence of each. So, our next concept is classical humanism. Now, with classical humanism, it emphasized the existence of humans, the individuals that made up a society, and it put a lot of weight into considerations of how one person fits into society, how to protect the person and make sure they have the best welfare, the best stability and safety as a person. Because of this, the body was important because the body is this house that needs to be trained up and protected in order to be healthy. Now, what this meant was that since the body was held in a high regard, that what we see, I may be getting ahead of myself, so let me get to the next slide, is yes, because this body is held in such high regard because of classical humanism, Greek gods were thought of as ideal humans. So when they were picturing what their gods look like, they were the epitome of fitness, the epitome of good, strong bodies. Like this god here was a god that by all counts was emotionally probably softer, but yet look at him. He's muscular. He's extremely strong individual of peak fitness. Now, their gods obviously were human-like, as you see here, and as you probably know from maybe high school literature courses or high school history courses, whatever it may be, but they were this human-shaped and human-like with human qualities. But when it came to the body of the gods, they were of peak condition. They were always depicted as having just magnificent, strong, ideal-looking bodies. Because of this, the Greeks wanted to resemble their gods. They wanted to be strong and fit and have a magnificent body like their gods did. So because of this, there was a high emphasis on training up and developing the body. And you can see that in Greek culture, and you can see that in some of the biblical accounts of the Greeks. there were depictions of athletic events and depictions of strong bodies as part of the like biblical text. Now, there's two concepts that came into play very heavily in Greek sport and Greek fitness and physical education, and that's these concepts of a rate and agon. Now, a rate is this. Each of these is probably pretty hard to put into words because we don't have words that necessarily completely capture the idea of each of these. So a rate was basically a concept of excellence, and that Greek athletes and Greek people were striving to be excellent, to be virtuous, to not only be successful and victorious, but also to do so with strong virtue, and to live up, as the PowerPoint says, to live up to someone's potential, and to do so at any cost. Now, the idea is that a rate can only happen when someone is striving and they're working towards something. You can't live up to your highest excellence and your potential if you aren't always and constantly striving for something better. And that's a great lesson for nowadays, beside the point that I'm trying to teach here. If you're trying to get better at something, you always have to be working towards it. You can't stop. You always have to reach your goal and say, okay, what is the next goal? What's our next point that we're trying to get to? So the idea is that you're striving. Now, because of that, if someone says that they have attained a rate, that's impossible. It's striving for something. Excellence is always out of touch. So if someone says, I have it, I've attained it, then really they've lost it. It's gone. If they had touched it, then it slipped through the fingers and moved on, because they are no longer striving if they think they have it. Because if you have something, you can't strive to get something because it's already there. So because of that, they will have passed on to this stage of excessive pride, which makes sense. If someone thinks that they've reached this peak excellence, the best that they could possibly be, well, that sounds really prideful, just even saying it here, right? So the other one, agon. Now, agon, you've probably heard of words that kind of have developed off of this Greek word, like agony or agonistic, something that's a struggle. So this struggle could also be a contest. So an actual competition would be an agon. A struggle within the competition would be an agon. So because this agon could be describing the process of training, like it says here in the PowerPoint, or it could also be more of a noun of saying the place of a contest, the place of competition. So if you go into the stadium, you're going into the house of agony, right? Because you are going to go there, you're going to work hard. It's going to be a struggle. You might be in agony in the middle of competition. I know many of you who've been athletes have, been at the end of a hard game or a hard match or whatever it may be, and you have this feeling of agony because it hurts, but you're striving and you're going to struggle and you are going to go into this contest. Or in training, you're in the weight room, you're out on the field, you're in conditioning, and you're in a state of agony. It doesn't feel good. You are struggling. That is part of the process of training. And the Greeks held this in high regard, which we do today too. We celebrate when someone, the commercials for Gatorade or whatever sports product you want to pick out, show someone sweating and struggling and they're maybe yelling out in pain as they push harder and harder. We celebrate this concept of agony, agon. as we strive for a rate like the ancient Greeks did. Like I said, it kind of connects to what we do nowadays, right? And these ideals, even though we're talking about this in the framed by physical education, this went far beyond just physical education. This was in schooling, education, music, philosophy, work. These were ideals that every Greek person was connected with and celebrated. And that's because the Greeks believed they were most like the gods when they were striving and they were struggling and they were competing to be excellent, because they were competing to be like the gods, right? And because of this, the Greek ideal, and we kind of saw this in other past chapters, was that they were excellent scholars, they were excellent athletes, they were excellent soldiers, sort of like in ancient China, they had the what was it, the seven ideals, or the seven categories, or the five categories that the ancient Chinese would have to do to become the perfect gentleman, if you remember that. Same idea here. Just like that one, you had to do, math well, you had to do equestrian well, you had to be able to ride horses, you had to be able to do archery well. Well, same idea with the Greeks. They thought you had to be smart, you had to be a good athlete, and you had to be a good soldier. And if you did that, you would serve your culture, you would serve your civilization, and you'd be someone worth celebrating because you'd be most similar to the gods in at least the best traits of these human-like gods that they worshipped. Now, Greek sports have a rich tradition that we built off of up until this day. So the main things we think of when we think of Greek sports is we think of the Olympic Games, the birth of the Olympic Games in 776 BC. That's a long time ago. And we've built into the modern games now, which is really interesting because just like the ancient Greeks, the Olympics were this peak athletic competition. So if you looked at ancient Greece, it's actually kind of split up into all these different city-states. There was little sections of ancient Greece that kind of functioned independent or had independent pride in one another, and kind of both in sports and in battle kind of went head to head a lot. But all of these groups celebrated the Olympic Games that happened every 4 years. And it's the same now. Just like nowadays, the peak, if you look across the world, the number one athletic event in the world is every 4 years the Olympic Games. And no matter where you go in the world, this is kind of filters in and is something that's celebrated. In fact, I just looked up, so I'm in, this is, like I told you, I work for Baylor Track and Field. I'm a coach here, so I'm in the coach's room right now. And on the wall, what do we got here? Our Olympic medalists celebrated. This is on the wall. This is something that I just looked up and saw, right? That's, that's there because that is what we celebrate today. It's the same idea. So we'll get into the Olympic Games and we'll talk about it. But another one that was big was the funeral games. So you may have heard of Achilles, not just the thing on your ankle, but what the thing on your ankle is named after. Achilles was this legendary Greek warrior that was unstoppable. He had been dipped in a river that made him essentially immortal, except he was hung by his Achilles tendon when they stuck him in the river, and that didn't go in the river, so he was immortal he was immortal everywhere except that Achilles heel. That's where he ended up getting shot by an arrow, and that's what killed him, according to legend. So Achilles is this famous Greek warrior. So one of his buddies dies. So he decides he wants to celebrate his friend and throw a magnificent festival, a magnificent game. So he creates the first of funeral games. So what happened is he throws a feast. That's what this picture is up here. He throws a feast. His buddy's body's there. They killed like, I want to say like 10 children and like 12 horses and piled a bunch of wood up around him. They have a big feast. They have this altar around the guy that died. They light a match, throw it on the thing, the children, the horses, the person being celebrated, all goes up, and that was a sacrifice to the gods. And then also, there was these games, mostly ones that mimicked war skills, like running and throwing a javelin and swimming, that sort of thing, and wrestling and boxing, that concept, like war topics that we've talked about before, sports that were based off war. And they had those games. So again, you see kind of these religious and festival vibes going through, again, yet another culture where sport is integrated into the religion and the culture and the celebration of things, in this case, the life of a friend. Now, because Greece is kind of in this Mediterranean region that's notoriously mild weather, warm in the summer, not too cold in the winter, they were able to do physical activity all year. So it really sprung up this culture of sport. Whereas if you looked at like ancient Scandinavian countries, it's too cold in the winter, they didn't really do sport, they went and hid inside. Germanic cultures, same idea. A little too cold, we don't do sports in the winter. That's not fun. That's not something we want to add to our festivals. So if you want to get into Greek sports, here's a link to a great YouTube documentary. It's like 50 minutes. Feel free to watch that. I'm going to cover a lot of the information in the coming slides, but if this is something that interests you, it would be a fun documentary to watch. So, Olympic Games. The first games, like I said earlier, happened in 776 BC. So we're looking at, almost 2,800 years ago. Now, just like today, the Olympic Games happened every 4 years, and that's called an Olympiad. Every 4 years, one Olympiad. So what you would have is essentially there was all, like I said, there's city-states. So you can think of little parts of ancient Greece that were kind of under the same banner, but also kind of independent. So each of these had all sorts of festivals, right? And they start to notice that this is something that kind of sprung up in this culture all across the civilization. So from these hundreds of festivals, all the city-states decided they wanted to unite and have a main competition. So no matter what wars they were having, no matter what skirmishes, no matter what disagreements, there was a truce called. So they would send messengers out from the city of Olympia, and they would go out and they would say, okay, it's time for the games. It's been 4 years. This is our date. Everyone come here. And there was a truce from that standpoint. And everyone would walk from whatever city-state they were from to Olympia, and they would send in their best and brightest athletes and people. And they would have safe travels there. In fact, there's a story of someone got robbed by a bunch of Greek soldiers on their way to Olympia, and the leader, Alexander the Great, actually sent money to kind of refund and pay up for what his soldiers did. So they would come into Olympia, and then they would have 30 days. They'd get there 30 days before, and that time they'd prove they were a citizen. They would prove that they had no criminal record, and then they would kind of swear on their gods that they didn't swear on the honor of Zeus or something along that line, that they had been training for the at least 10 months prior to this competition. And then they would have the games. Now, we see stadiums from all the city-states survive, but this is a picture of Olympia. This was the stadium. As you can see, really not a ton. So this top one is Olympia. This is a different one down here, I believe. All that you had is you have this tunnel right here that they would come out to, similar today, you go to a basketball game, they shoot smoke and fire, and the athletes run out to all sorts of lights from a tunnel. Same idea here. And then the only other structure outside of our just shy of 200-meter long dirt track is you can see a little judges table right where my pointer is, if you look there. And that's where the judges would sit. Everyone else sat on the hills. There could have been, huge crowds were packed. There's stories of it just being packed and sweaty and kind of gross. And yet, like today, there's this special charm, this special feeling associated with the Olympics that people would ignore the discomfort in order to see these games. And here's some of our events. The first Olympiad, it was a stadion race. One shot of the stadium. Like I said, it's about 200 meters, a little shy. And then they come up with the dialulos, the double stadium, which means they'd go down and back. So just shy of a 400-meter race was added. After that, in the next one, they have the long race. That was about 4,800 meters, roughly. And they had pentathlon and wrestling, boxing, chariot racing, horse racing, and then all these other categories that you can go down all the way to the 145th Olympiad in 200 BC. So over the course of almost 600 years, they've added and built up this competition. Main ones, again, are these foot races, boxing, wrestling, chariots, and another one that was big was race in armor. So they would actually they'd put on armor and they would run and see how fast they could actually run in the armor. And as you can see, again, a lot of these events are based off war and celebrating that a well-rounded person is an athlete, a soldier, and a scholar. So in these ancient Olympic Games, they built up, it was really elaborate, right? So you would come to the stadium, and the stadium, as you saw, was rather plain, but there was huge temples, huge buildings. It was a little city that was there. And we can see a lot of what happened through art forms. So you can look and say, we can even recreate different events. So you could say, they had a long jump. How did they do the long jump? Well, we see these pictures on vases of them and various steps of their jump. We can then extrapolate from that their technique, and we know they, jumped off one leg or they jumped off two legs. Whatever happens, you could tell using their art forms. And the art forms would also celebrate military triumphs. Again, this was a place of celebrating success, Olympia. And the Greeks believed that that victory, the success, came from the gods, whether it was athletic, military, or other, that came from the gods. Now, because of this, Olympia, this place where victory would happen and you were celebrating victory, it was sacred because they thought the gods would actually come to Olympia and they enjoyed watching the mortals compete. So they would sit and they'd watch this competition, they'd watch the agon happen, and they would derive enjoyment from that. Now, because victory was held in high regard, just like today, you have cheating that would occur in ways that people would get around and break the rules. If they were caught, this was obviously frowned upon because, as I told you before, they kind of swore on the name of Zeus that they wouldn't break the rules, they wouldn't cheat. So if they did, they owed the gods, they owed the competition. Because one of the main punishments that was pretty common was a very large fine. So they would have to pay for a bronze statue to be made. They would then have to carry the statue and erect the statue on these like blocks. And for many years, those statues stood outside of Olympia. Now they're unfortunately gone now, but that's what would happen. But because there was so much financial and honor involved in winning these games and positions of power, you would see that cheating occur. So one other thing about the ancient Olympic Games is, unlike today, only male citizens in good standing, ones who were citizens and hadn't broken any laws, were permitted to compete and watch. Women were not, married women were not allowed to attend. If they did, off with their head. That was a big no-no. In some circumstances, virgins could attend, ones who weren't married. And then there was an exception. There was one married woman who was allowed, and that was a priestess who was allowed to view the games and was like a special guest who was allowed to come. And later, what you see is women started to, especially once the Romans came, you started to see women. It was becoming more common for women to hold different roles. In fact, if a woman owned a horse and chariot, she could enter the competition, but she would just have to leave after and not watch it. So it's unlike today where we celebrate. We have household names now, like Allison Felix, Simone Biles, Katie Ledecky, are household names. The Olympics are for men and women, which is a great thing, but that was not the original way it happened. Now, the Olympics adapted, much like today, where you'll see events added, like skateboarding, I think, is added to the Tokyo Olympics, or maybe it's Paris coming up in 3 years at this point. But they also became longer. So they became 5 days long. There was competitive events, there was religious events that were occurring. Along with that, you would have competition in arts, philosophy, poetry, music. This was a place of victory, a place of competition. And as we talked about earlier, these concepts of agon and I always want to say it wrong, arete, were transcended beyond athletics into the arts, philosophy, poetry, and music. So those competitions would also part of Greek society in pleasing the gods. So originally what happened was the Olympics were amateur events. You couldn't be a professional athlete. It was very spiritual, but that kind of eroded away, especially once the Romans came and started influencing the Olympics. So what happened there is these amateur athletes were no longer amateur. You didn't have to be amateur to be in the Olympics, which I don't know if you guys know this, but even when the Olympics were restarted in 1896, you had to be an amateur athlete all the way until, I don't know what year. Surprisingly recently, you had to be an amateur athlete to go to the Olympics. But they eventually became celebrities. And because of that, you started to see that city-states would lure Olympians to their city by wealth and material possessions. So it was like free agents, where it's like, okay, I just won the Olympics. Until I start losing, I know that people from all these different cities are going to take me. So let's go over here to um, Sparta and see what they'll give me. Oh, you'll give me a house and a pension and you know, whatever. Well, okay, let's compare that to um, you know, maybe Olympia or whatever, and they'll give me this or that. So, oh, I'm going to go this way. And then if that wasn't working out and they started winning even more, maybe they would say, you know what? Oh, we got a better deal over here. Let's go over there. So it's sort of like Olympians today, where they were celebrities, but they were also allowed to kind of switch who they represented, unlike today, where once you declare a nationality, it's pretty hard to switch. It does happen occasionally, like Bernard Lagat in distance running representing Kenya and now represents the United States. That sort of thing, where there's kind of ways where you can switch nationality. But back then, it was just a matter of who's going to take me, who's going to pay me the most. And the reality is that these people were kind of considered very godlike for mortals. Because they were peak fitness, they represented what the gods were. They were well-rounded in the Greek societal standard. So because of that, I kind of covered this. They believed in developing mind and body. In fact, Greek philosophers, I didn't get into Greek philosophers much. I didn't feel like I could do that justice. And I assume that you probably have a philosophy class that you required to take. If not, maybe we can talk about that on more of a one-on-one where it's easier to kind of explain concepts. But Plato and Socrates were these two big philosophers whose names continue on today and are studied today. And they were actually excellent athletes. We don't know a ton about Socrates because he didn't write his own stuff. In fact, we get most of what Socrates does from Plato because Plato was Socrates' student. Well, we know Plato was an excellent wrestler. In fact, they can't prove for certain because there's no official record of who won the Olympics one year, but a lot of kind of roundabout ways that you can kind of assume that Plato actually won the Olympics. So he was an excellent, amazing wrestler. And he used that sport to develop both mind and body, which was this pinnacle of achievement in Greek culture. Now, we have the Olympics today, and we had the Olympics in ancient Greece, but there was a disconnect, a period of time where that stopped. In fact, it was a pretty large period of time. And that was and no one really knows officially why it stopped. One major theory is actually that the Christian Roman emperors, once the Roman emperors converted to Christianity, there was a big push to outlaw pagan cults and pagan practices. Now, as we've talked about, the Olympics were a celebration of their gods, and their gods were deeply interwoven into the Olympic competition. So when the Christian emperor said, let's get rid of everything pagan, that began to include things like the temple at Olympia, which was destroyed in AD 435, about 40 years after pagan cults were outlawed. And because of this, any games that were kind of associated with pagan activities started to cease and fall off because that was against the law. There was penalties for that. But likely some form of the Olympics, a dispersed form of the Olympics where it's no longer happening in one place, but rather we have these competitions that happened in Olympic spirit, continued for a certain amount of time. But then it went on pause, and we didn't see it again until, I think, 1896. And then, of course, every 4 years since, until last year when we made it 5 years, and hopefully the Olympics will happen. But that's the ancient Greece. If you have any questions, shoot me an email. I know it's starting to get, hopefully the class is starting to pick up as we get closer and closer to modern time and get things that are more and more influenced in today. Again, if you haven't already, please sign up for your groups. We aren't going to get to that. It's not due for over a month, I want to say. You can check the syllabus and do count off weeks, but which I'll check for you guys soon. But do communicate with your groups. It'd be nice if you're in the early semester when things are kind of still slow. I know it feels busy, but it always feels busy and then feels really busy later in the semester. So if you could knock those out right away, that'd be great. Again, really, really want to encourage you guys to reach out to me. I want to meet you guys and interact with you guys. I kind of hate sitting. I'm just kind of floating around different places here of campus and filming these, but never getting to interact with you guys. And I would really like to do that and kind of help guide this project. I think it would be good if I was sitting in those meetings and kind of giving you maybe fun ideas where you could take some of this information, because I have to stick to the script because that's my job. You guys don't necessarily, so I could kind of help guide you into things in ways you can connect modern day to where some of our modern concepts came from, and then maybe use that to reevaluate modern concepts, if that makes sense. So there's some fun stuff we can do with these projects. Anyways, filled my time for today, but I will see you next week.